Hello, everybody, and welcome in to another episode of the Couch GMs podcast. It is Tuesday, January 4th, 2022. I'm your host, George Kerth, here along with Cody Roadcap, and we can start playing We Are the Champions in the background. Am I right, Cody?
Absolutely. It was such an exciting week 17. Hopefully you guys had some great fantasy stories. Feel free to share them with us because we'd love to hear them. George and I were in a scenario where I had Devontae Adams in one league. He was going against Devontae Adams in the next league. He needed Devontae Adams to score less than 23 points or something like that. I needed him to score at least 22 points to win, and somehow Devontae fell right in between, and we were both able to get a championship this week. Our third co-host, Tyler Snyder, who hasn't been here for a while, unfortunately, he did not get a fantasy championship, but I do have to give him a major shout out because he brought home the real prize. Our man, he got engaged today, the day we're recording it. She said yes. Shelby, I don't know what you're thinking, but congrats. We're happy for both of them. So I had to give him a little shout out. Make sure you show him some love as well.
Definitely. Congrats, Tyler and Shelby, and congrats, Cody, for your championship there. I am now the only person who didn't say girlfriend. I feel like I have to get used to. I'm still calling your fiance girlfriend now here, so I have to
Just don't let her hear it, and that's fine
adjusting
with
in
me.
my brain now. I mean, if she listens in, she heard it 2 weeks ago or 2 episodes ago, so I'm already in trouble. You had to correct me.
Yep, I did that to protect you. You're good. You're good. But yeah, what an incredible week. And guys, again, hopefully you had a good championship weekend. I know there were some heartbreaks out there, but we're going to talk about in a little bit why it is so important that you play your championship in week 17 and not week 18.
Yes, because this week is going to be a disaster. But if any of you are playing in Week 18, we're going to do our best to help you guys through it. On today's show, we're going to cover some NFL news and notes, give you a little bit of an NFL playoff update. Obviously, we're going to talk some waivers. We're going to hit quotes of the week, and we're going to talk about teams who could rest their starters this week. So maybe some teams and players to avoid for your Week 18 championships. Make sure you're following us on our social media channels and check us out on thecouchgms.com. Cody, let's jump into NFL news. Now, I know there were some viral videos that have gone around this week for games. One I'll just touch on really quick. Jalen Hurts almost got crunched by a railing in the Washington football team stadium. Fans were trying to give him a high five after the game. But the biggest one that sent shockwaves through the NFL. Oh, go ahead.
Before we go there, I want to say, I want to give a massive shout out to Jalen Hurts. You know, everyone talks about how he's a great human being, a great person on and off the field. The dude literally had the opposing team stadium fall onto him because fans were trying to high five. Everyone avoided like major injury or anything like that, but he still took the time to help people up. He gave hugs. He took pictures. Like, he made the most out of the situation. Like, obviously, you're never going to forget falling into the tunnel as an NFL fan unintentionally. But the fact that Jalen Hurts was so cool about it, like, his instant reaction was definitely to like reach down and make sure people were okay, and then still give the high fives. And he wasn't like, "Ooh, get away from me." Like, he definitely was like there for the fans. That was, from someone not in the Eagles fan base, that was definitely cool to see.
Definitely. I agree with that too. We saw an angle from his back yesterday. There was an angle from the front that a fan took today. He had some quick footwork there trying to avoid that railing. He was close to getting hit, but everyone's okay.
Sweet
like
cleats
you said.
too.
Yeah, you're right.
Big fan of cleats, and he had some sweet ones on. So that footwork video was highlighted by some incredible cleats.
But someone who was wearing much less gear as he left the field, Antonio Brown is back. Well, I guess he's kind of gone, actually. There was a whole situation. We do not know the full story on what was going on with Antonio Brown. But what I hear is he was injured coming into the week. The Buccaneers thought he was okay, wanted him to come into play, and he took offense to that, said he couldn't do it. They told him, if you're not going to play, you get off the field, kicked him off the sideline. He proceeded to take off his jersey and shoulder pads, his undershirt and his gloves, threw his undershirt and gloves into the stands as he ran off the field doing jumping jacks, hyping up the crowd.
Yeah.
I'm just going to leave it there, Cody. React.
I'm a little speechless, just like I was. Don't get me wrong. As much as I love football, I was watching Red Zone at the time. I was not glued into the Jets-Buccaneers game, despite the Jets being up. And next thing you know, Andrew Siciliano came on. He was like, "You got to see what's going on in New York or New Jersey," and it was the shot of Antonio Brown jumping up and down, and then they kept showing close-ups of his like jersey like stuck between the two benches, and I was like, "What's going on?" And everyone was like, "I can't believe he quit on his team." And then it came out today that was like, well, he got into it because he said he was hurt to still play. Like, don't get me wrong, like I don't want to perceive anything. Like doing jumping jacks and playing NFL football is completely different. But they were losing pretty bad to the Jets. Is a little embarrassing. But maybe he was hurt. He did not practice Thursday. He did not practice Friday, so he was definitely banged up a little bit. He's been dealing with an ankle injury all season. And so for the coach to say either play or get off the field, I know Antonio Brown has like the shortest leash of anybody after all the things he's been through. Um, but like almost like a forcing your player back in with an ultimatum. That's something that the NFL has to look in as well. Not just because now, granted, Antonio Brown made it. If he would have just left, nobody would have talked. But the way he exited, it is also worth noting after the game. Uh, Bruce Arians did say he is no longer a Buck. But as of 4 o'clock on Monday when waivers ran, he is still technically on the roster. Apparently, they are looking for guidance for the NFL. Maybe there's
Probably
something with the
trying to make sure
contract.
they don't get into a cap trouble. Yeah.
Maybe there's something with the contract. Maybe that the NFL is looking into the comments made that either get in or get off the sideline. Because yes, there's being cleared by the medical doctors, but you also have a person. You have to be 100% confident in your body being able to hold up to go out into the game. So there's definitely a side of that too that needs to be talked about. But this is probably the end of the Antonio Brown in the NFL. It is honestly one of the weirder careers. Like the dude is an elite talent, Hall of Fame statistics. Will he get in? That's a different question. Should he get in? Probably, but would he is a big question. He goes out. I know there was talk that he was only a few catches, a few yards, and a touchdown away from
Mhm.
making an extra $1 million this season that he quote unquote left on the table. I mean, but it just a weird. I the Antonio Brown like was so weird, but what might not even been like the weirdest thing on Sunday, in terms of how the games fell. But like, I don't think I'll ever see anything like that on how it portrayed.
Definitely not. I feel like if you would have told me this happened, I wouldn't have believed you. Like I found out because I was watching two games on Fox, the Eagles and the Ravens game, or during that 1 o'clock window, and I saw a tweet come through that was very weird talking about Antonio Brown. And as soon as I went on Twitter to try to investigate it, Fox did a game break to talk about it. Fox barely does game breaks for touchdowns half the time, and they did a game break of Antonio Brown running off the field. So that was something. It was definitely the buzz of the early window of games. But I am a little bit worried about Antonio Brown. And it goes back to I think it was 2016 when he got knocked out by Vontez Burfict and when he was playing the Bengals. Like there was a serious change in his attitude sometime around that time. I am honestly worried that a head injury is his problem. Maybe pre-stage CTE or something like that. I'm not saying he was ever a model citizen. He was always a little strange, but I feel like it's gotten worse since then. And it's something that we have to, like, I hope he's okay as much as I think he is ridiculous. I don't know how much in control he even is.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And a lot of people, people will be like, "Oh, what a clown! What I can't believe you do this. What kind of player does this?" But I also do think it is an important reminder to remember that these are people. Yes, everybody makes decisions that you don't believe are right in your lifetime, not just professional football players. And at the end of the day, if Antonio Brown needs some sort of help, let's hope that he gets it. If you know, help that he can, work towards a better path if that's what he needs. Maybe he just had enough. We don't know. I don't want to. I'm not a doctor. I have no medical background to speculate on. Does he have head trauma or anything like that? But that was a pretty gruesome hit. Like the timeline fits with how that goes. So again, as much as you might not like the antics, you might not like the player, you might, quote unquote, call him like a locker room cancer. Just remember that there is still a person behind the face mask, and that our number one goal. It should be getting help for Antonio Brown if he needs it. And for anybody out there, not just football players, don't be afraid to reach out if you need help, because that's what, as a society, we need to do better at that, is promoting, getting help, and being there for others when they need it.
Definitely. I think there's been a theme that has snuck through this entire season of mental health matters. And this is just another thing that could add on top of that. But I think we have talked enough Antonio Brown. Why don't we talk a little bit of COVID here, because it is still a thing. Even though it may be less serious, a lot of these players probably have a good chance to clear before their games this weekend. But there were 36 positives in the NFL on Monday. The Packers, Vikings, and Lions had multiple offensive linemen and defenders go on the list. No one really notable for fantasy stats, but it's important to know that they have a bit of an outbreak happening. The Eagles were the team that got hit the hardest. They put 12 players on the list themselves. Big names included Dallas Goedert, Boston Scott, and Jordan Howard. If you remember, Miles Sanders is already out, so big hits to the running back room, and one of the best tight ends in the league if you are a team still playing in Week 18.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see some more COVIDs come in Tuesday and Wednesday, and then they'll trickle down, but we'll still get a couple Thursday, Friday, and sometimes they have huge implications. Like, the Vikings essentially had a playoff game this past week, but they found out Thursday that Kirk Cousins was tested positive and he was unvaccinated. So they were down to a guy that was just coming off the COVID list for a game they had absolutely had to win to keep their season alive. So COVID is definitely going to play a big impact on how these playoffs go. The good news, if there is good news for catching COVID and the Eagles running back, they clinched the playoffs already. And now that they've had COVID, they are no longer required to test for, I believe, 90 days, which will take them through the Super Bowl. So if your team's in the playoffs, I hate to say this is the week to get COVID if you're going to get COVID. I hope everyone can stop getting COVID. Like, that's the number one goal. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, this has been a terrible 2 years, going on 3 years of trying to fight this pandemic. But for a football sake purely, if your team's in, this is the week to get it, because it hopefully will help prevent you from having bumps in the road down the into the playoffs. But again, if we can just eradicate this altogether, that would be even better.
Definitely. And I actually received a little bit more clarity on the testing rules today. So I found out players that are vaccinated are only tested, 1, if they're symptomatic, 2, if they are randomly selected. So I guess similar to the random drug testings that the NFL does, or 3, if they volunteer. So the word around the league is a lot of these players are volunteering to be tested on a Monday, knowing that if they test positive, they have 5 days and can get back before the game that weekend, so that they either will not miss time, or if they do test positive, like you said, they get it out of the way in a situation where then, it's not going to affect them in the playoffs or whatever. So there's a good chance with the Eagles now having a seemingly meaningless game this week, their entire roster might have volunteered to get tested, and now these 12 players are clear through the Super Bowl.
Well, George, hold your horses on the Eagles getting to the Super Bowl, but at least they're cleared.
That's what I didn't say they were making the Super Bowl. I just said those players are cleared of testing.
I just had to clarify, because we've seen the Eagles go on some incredible runs with some quarterbacks that you didn't think would ever make it. So you never can rule them out once the playoffs start. But speaking of the playoffs, we got a little bit of clarity on the playoff picture. We'll start in the NFC, because that picture is a little bit clearer. The Packers locked up the number 1 seed. It will go through Lambeau Field. The Cardinals and the Rams, the Cowboys, and I believe the Buccaneers, they're all fighting for the 2 seed through the 5th seed. The big matchup the big name is going to be who wins the NFC West between the Cardinals and or the Rams. The other teams that are still in the mix, the Eagles have locked it up, and then the 49ers and the Saints are the other 2 teams that are fighting for that final spot. Which honestly, I feel like it's going to be the 49ers at this point, but you can't rule out the Saints, and the 49ers do have the divisional matchup against the Seattle Seahawks, who always play them tough. So definitely some fun matchups going into this week. George, why don't you let everyone know about the AFC side?
All right. On the AFC side, we have the Chiefs, Titans, and Bengals clinch their divisions. them three and the Patriots have a shot at the number 1 seed. The Buffalo Bills are the other team that they have currently the division lead over the Patriots, but they do not have a chance for the 1 seed because of some crazy tiebreakers. I don't quite understand that, but that's how it works. Those are the 5 teams that are locked currently in the playoffs, the Colts and the Chargers. The Chargers are playing the Raiders, which is essentially a play-in game, which is why I got moved to Sunday Night Football next week. The Steelers are still in the mix if they win on Monday. Obviously, we're recording this before Monday Night Football, so you guys will know if the Steelers are still in the mix or not. And then the Baltimore Ravens are in a situation where they could get in if the Colts lose to the Jaguars, which is very unlikely. They could take the spot of the Chargers or Raiders if they were, like, whichever team would lose.
Definitely, there'll be some fun matchups there to watch pan out. As of right now, I think it's going to stay as is, and the Colts and Chargers can make it in. But we've seen weirder things throughout the NFL season. But that's pretty much all of our NFL news. So I think it's time for George's favorite segment, Quotes of the Week.
Quotes of the week, I feel like, is taking us back to somewhere fairly familiar again, but these quotes are just too good to pass up. So, I'll preface this one with, coming into the day, the leader for Rookie of the Year was Mack Jones. Mack Jones proceeded to lead his team to 50-plus points last week and finished the week as the number 2 in odds for Offensive Rookie of the Year because Jamar Chase had himself a game. So then in his post-game press conference, Jamar Chase was asked if he should be the Offensive Rookie of the Year, and his quote was, "I better be."
Dude, I love the confidence. Maybe I'm biased, and I'll say it right now. Over the last couple of years, there's been a wide receiver in every draft that I've been a huge fan of. This year, you might say I took the easy answer, and I said I love Jamar Chase. He's the top guy. When they were debating him, Waddle, Devontae Smith, I said no, it's Jamar Chase. 2 years ago, I was bullish on Justin Jefferson. Maybe I'm just, falling. I don't like LSU, but maybe I'm just picking the LSU guys. But Jamar Chase, he went out there, had himself a day, one-on-one coverages. I mean, you can argue like the Chiefs didn't ever switch it up. Like there was 3rd and 27, and they still ran single high one-on-one coverage to Jamar Chase where he was able to catch it for 28 yards. It's like, guys, you couldn't
What are the Chiefs doing?
What are the Chiefs doing? But he went out there, he made plays, he helped carry the Bengals to a thrilling victory against the Kansas City Chiefs to lock up that division. Shout out to the Bengals. They were a team that nobody really thought had any chance of making the playoffs this year. We all thought they'd be, we all thought the Bengals, we saw the budding potential, but we're all like, oh, this team's a year away. Well, a lot of thanks to Jamar Chase and the play of Joe Burrow, they fast-tracked that, and they are now the AFC North champions, which I don't think many of us saw coming.
I mean, I know I didn't. A lot of Bengals fans didn't either. I like Joe Burrow, but I didn't see that progression coming that fast. We got one more quote from Joe Burrow, and he said, quote, "Everyone knows that meme. F it, Jamar's down there somewhere." And I could just imagine that in my head as I'm reading that. I don't know if you can too, Cody, because you've seen that a million times, but that's what it looked like they were doing. Like, if it's one-on-one, he's like, I don't care where the coverage is. He's down there somewhere.
Absolutely. And I mean, don't get me wrong. He did have that long touchdown. I believe it was 72 yards, where it was more like an outbreaker that he turned back across the field and scored a touchdown. But some of them were just deep jump balls. And I mean, Jamar Chase did have 11 catches for 266 yards, broke the record for most receptions in a game most receiving yards in a game by a rookie quarterback. And Joe Burrow has almost 1,000 passing yards over the last 2 weeks, just under it. And he's taking that meme to heart. I mean, he's just throwing it up to Jamar Chase. He's doing it to T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd. And I mentioned it last week, and you kind of were like, I can't believe you're asking, but I think, in my opinion, I think Joe Burrow he might not have overtaken Rodgers for the MVP, but I think he passed Jonathan Taylor.
Yeah, I mean, that's possible. And then the other name I heard that jumped in the conversation this week that may have passed Jonathan Taylor is Cooper Kupp. Like, the MVP race might actually be interesting this year, and it's not just quarterbacks. Like, Joe Burrow and Aaron Rodgers are both up there, and then you have to talk about Jonathan Taylor and Cooper Kupp.
Yeah, I think this year's gonna be like, don't get me wrong. I think it's a 2-man race at this point between Joe Burrow
Mhm.
and Aaron Rodgers, and I'm being generous of saying it's a 2-man race. I do know there is. I've heard some rumblings from people around the league, and you've all heard from them too, because I don't have any inside sources, even though I like to believe. But there is some rumblings because of some of the controversial comments that Aaron Rodgers has made this season, that they're trying to like sway that into the MVP conversation, similar to how T.O. had Hall of Fame numbers, but they're like, we're not going to make him first ballot to show him a lesson. Like, one, we don't need that in the NFL. We don't need policing. Like, if you don't agree with his comments, you don't agree with his comments. You can't argue that he's putting up incredible numbers on the field. Even as Packer fans, I haven't agreed with all his comments, but that's beside the point. We're not getting into all that. So I think it's the 2 quarterback race, but that offensive player of the year between Jonathan Taylor and Cooper Kupp, that is going to be an even more exciting battle to see how that unfolds. And we're going to talk about all of the potential guys. We're going to pick our winners hopefully next week or maybe the week after that once Tyler gets back with us. So we have all 3 of us on as we head to the playoffs, which I think it's a good thing to note.
One
This will
sec,
be our.
Ben.
Oh, George, you got one. So you want to say something?
I was gonna say I was gonna turn this whole thing into a fantasy lesson before we moved on to our next segment. So if you want to add anything else afterwards, that's fine. But you're talking about a guy that's going up there and just grabbing jump balls all the time in Jamar Chase. If you remember the preseason, Jamar Chase had the dropsy so bad. Everyone was worried about it. He was dropping way down in the draft boards. He was down at or below where the other Bengals wide receivers are being drafted because everyone was worried about his hands. And now we're already at a situation where we could say maybe he has some of the better hands in the league. We cannot overreact on the preseason next year. If this is a perfect example of that. So I just wanted to throw that out there as a looking forward, read everything and take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, I think there's definitely that's a good point, and we'll try to remind us that and that's a perfect tie into what was getting ready to say as well. Just a little scheduling note: this will be our last week as a 2-episode a week podcast. We are going to go one show a week through the playoffs. We're still debating if we're going to take a little hiatus to regroup, regear for the season, and then pick back up with draft coverage, get you all ready for your fantasy, and keep talking football. Because if you're like us, which you are because you're listening to this podcast, about 3 weeks after the Super Bowl, you're like, man, I really missed the football season. So we'll be back in here to talk all fantasy football with that. But the fantasy football season is not over for a few people. Again, I'm going to always encourage you to move your championship, talk to your commissioner, leave your league, do whatever you can to get out of the Week 18 championship. But George, let's get into some waivers and streamers for those who are still playing.
Waivers and streamers, we're going to try to hit a little bit from every single position here. And I think this first one's going to sound a little bit familiar because he's somebody who we talked about heavily last week. He might have had a slow start, but ended up with a decent week. Trey Lance is probably your top quarterback on the board for this week. Obviously, we talked so much about him last week. I don't really know how much I'm going to say, but running quarterbacks are a cheat code. He's got great legs. That's about all I got.
Well, and I think it's also worth noting with Trey. So one, we do have to monitor the injury reports as the season progresses. I know there was some talks that they're hoping to get Jimmy G back this week, but we'll see if they save him for the playoffs or not. But Trey Lance, you mentioned he had a slow start, but he also had like more air yards than like the last. I can't remember the exact number of games of or air yards per attempt than Jimmy Garoppolo. Like we talk about it as a runner, but he was also pushing the ball down the field because they were using the play action. They got Elijah Mitchell back, so they helped their explosive run game. And Trey Lance, despite the slow start, still put up 20 fantasy points. Like he finishes at QB1 this week. Like that is a great week. That's a great guy. If you were scared to start him, rookie in the semifinals, and you didn't want to pick him, hopefully you at least picked him up. But if you didn't, go out there and get Trey Lance. Unfortunately, if they do pull the switch to Jimmy Garoppolo, you could be stuck out there a little bit for potential, streaming options. But sticking with the quarterback, if this isn't a guy on the waivers, but I'll throw, or he's probably on the waivers, but a guy I'll throw in there is Derek Carr. The guy has been top 5 all season in passing yards. We've seen the Chargers defense be able to be throw on. I mean, the Houston Texans played pretty well. The Broncos, despite Drew Lock leaving the game for a little bit, then coming back, their passing attack looked, at least a little bit better against this Chargers defense. It still wasn't like electrifying, but that's more of that offense than. But the Raiders divisional, throwing it all around, I do like Derek Carr as a streaming option as well.
That's a great addition there. I'm sure we'll have more quarterbacks to add on later in the show or when we're doing our game breakdowns later in the week, but we can move on to running backs here. First guy I'm going to throw out there is Kenny Gainwell. Very interesting ad here because Miles Sanders is already hurt in Philly. Boston Scott and Jordan Howard both just hit the COVID list, and we don't know if they're going to play their starters or not. So it might not be a bad idea to go out there and grab Kenny Gainwell if you're running back desperate in this situation. If you're in a daily fantasy situation where you want someone cheap, he could be a solid option on a team that runs the ball very well.
Yeah, I do like the Kenny Gainwell ad again. We do have the new COVID parameters, so some of these running backs could get back. And I don't want to spoil what we're going to talk about in the next segment, but there's potential that some of these guys might not play because they already have the playoffs locked up. Their positioning can't change too much, so they might try to rest their guys and stay healthy for the playoffs. So Kenny Gainwell, a rookie, let's see what this guy can do type of mentality against the Dallas Cowboys. I know it's a tougher defense, but if he's the only guy or one of the only 2 guys that are available, and we talked about it, even though guys are getting cleared, we've seen time and time again, players that come right off the COVID list into playing, they struggle. There's reports after the game they were exhausted. Just because they can come back in 5 days doesn't mean they're 100% after 5 days.
Exactly. So, and we've actually saw a situation a few weeks ago where Boston Scott had a non-COVID illness, came back, and he was very limited because they didn't want to use him without the practice time and coming off
He
of that
goosed that week.
illness.
I
He
remember.
goosed
I
that week,
played him.
yes. Yeah, they used Jordan Howard and Kenny Gainwell that week. So there you go. There's a good possibility, especially we're talking about the same exact team, that the Eagles will not want to use Jordan Howard or Boston Scott that heavily coming off of a COVID illness. Kenny Gainwell could be a lead back.
Definitely agree with that one. Another guy we have to talk about is another Buccaneers running back. That is Keyshawn Vaughn. He seemed to be the favorite this week against the Jets. Now, the Jets are the worst team in the NFL against fantasy running backs. So he has to get a big game. It does appear that, again, I wasn't following this game super closely, but Ronald Jones appeared to tweak something. He definitely got favored out throughout the second half of that game. They used Keyshawn on. Maybe it was down and he's more of a pass catcher. But I do think you can roll with. I keep wanting to call him CJ, and his name is Keyshawn, and it's why I'm stuttering so bad because I'm like, it's not CJ, it is Keyshawn. But Keyshawn Vaughn, the Panthers are a pretty decent matchup, but they just played him 2 weeks ago and they ran the ball pretty well. So I do like Keyshawn Vaughn if you need a waiver option heading into a championship matchup.
I'll move us into the wide receiver category, which has a bunch of names that I feel like in a normal week we wouldn't really be talking about. But coming into week 18, there's so many unknowns. There's a couple of guys kind of breaking out. Going to the Jets. They've been so interesting. Beginning of the season, they had Corey Davis was a semi-decent option. Middle of the season, Elijah Moore was really breaking out and showing his rookie potential. He got hurt. They both got hurt. Now we're on to Braxton Berrios. I believe he is a second-year guy. He never really got his flash, but these last few weeks, he's been pretty solid. Zach Wilson seems to like to feed the ball to one reliable target, and that guy is slowly becoming Braxton Berrios over these last few weeks.
Yeah, I think you mentioned Elijah Moore, like the slot receiver, and that is kind of where Braxton Berrios has squeezed right in. A couple weeks ago, we saw him make that, trick play on like third and like 30 almost, where they ran an in route and then they threw it backwards to him and he just jolted up the sideline. But ever since then, he's become he's fast. He's their kick returner. They've been making him a bigger part of their offense. 2 weeks ago, he had 5 catches. This past week, he had 8 catches for 65 yards and a touchdown. And if your team does, a lot of leagues don't do this, but I know of at least one league that I was in this year. They count return touchdowns for your offensive players as well. So if you're in that league, that's something to keep in mind because he has that potential to return it to the house. But just, he's a playmaker. And if you're desperate on waivers, I mean, the good news is there wasn't a huge number of injuries this past week. So that's why waivers are pretty low. There's a lot of matchups that are questionable or of who's all going to play. But Braxton Berrios is definitely a sleeper option to play in your flex. Or if you miss fantasy football and your championship wrapped up and you're going to play some daily fantasy this week, like George and I probably will, Braxton Berrios is a guy that could be a solid option in that as well.
Yeah, totally. And then I think since we talked about feeding into the preseason too much earlier this episode, another one. We were super high on Marquez Callaway on the Saints coming into the season. We thought he was going to be that solid number one, the fantasy savior in New Orleans. And he's been rough most of the season, but he's finally starting to come around a little bit. He looked pretty good with Taysom Hill at quarterback there this past week, and he has been gaining more targets as the weeks have gone on. So he's finally somebody who may not be the best play, but if you're desperate, looking for a discount in daily or whatever it might be, Marquez Callaway is at least on your radar.
Yeah, I think I'm really interested. I agree. We probably definitely overhyped him. He went from a guy that wasn't being drafted to some people taking his early in the 10th round, which I think even we all thought was all crazy. We did like him as like a last round flyer, last couple round flyer options. Didn't pan out. I would be interested to see how his trajectory would have went if Jameis stayed healthy all year because they went through the spurt with Simeon and then Taysom Hill. Because he's more of a down the field threat. So if Jameis Winston would have played, I wonder if he would have came onto the scene a little bit sooner. He did deal with a couple of drops, but he's another big play threat. So if you're looking for a really cheap option that has potential to catch it for 60 and a touchdown in one play, that's Marquez Callaway. So I do like him as low. He has a low floor, but he has a really high ceiling type of ad if you need someone this week.
Definitely is a good play if you're a team that's an underdog and the waiver wire is destroyed and you need wide receiver help. That's where I think you would go with someone like him. Otherwise, you'd probably go with someone a little safer, like maybe one of the two that Cody are about to mention here.
Yeah, I'm gonna steal the Bucks guy, the guy that caught the game-winning touchdown against the Jets, and that is Cyril Grayson. We just talked about Antonio Brown, how he is not officially, but according to the head coach, no longer a Tampa Bay Buccaneer. We saw Mike Evans play in a limited role as he comes back from his hamstring injury. Chris Godwin is still out with his injury. He's not coming back this season. So this team likes to throw the ball. This is the first time in Tom Brady's career that he's had back-to-back 40 touchdown games, which is pretty crazy to think about because you think 40 is like almost like a number that all the quarterbacks hit, but I feel like even it's really not. Like there's the mid 30s is where a lot of people end up in 40s, and we just were spoiled by like the Patrick Mahomes back-to-back 50 that we forget that getting to 40 is even a tough number. And Tom Brady is still, even at his age, throwing it all around. Yes, Rob Gronkowski's there. Mike Evans will be healthy, but Cyril Grayson is another deep play threat that is coming on strong. We saw Tyler Johnson drop a couple balls this past week. He dropped one critical third down. You have to think Grayson continues to get some more playing time. He's not only a guy that I like as a waiver wire this week, deep, a daily fantasy, but a guy we might be talking about next week when we talk about some like NFL playoff challenge too.
Definitely. And it's very interesting how that wide receiver room in Tampa Bay has shook out after all this situation. Like they were one of the trios that we were really worried about because they were three. All of a sudden they're down to one. And we're like, oh, well, they have the Tyler Johnsons and the Scotty Millers of the world. They're going to be the next guys up. And Cyril Grayson comes out of nowhere. And here he is making plays, scoring game-winning touchdowns. It's something that you never saw coming. It's something none of us would have saw coming, but we have to just jump on the train and hope it takes us through the playoffs at this point.
Absolutely. And, speaking of those trios, the biggest injury news of the week was wide receiver number 3 for the Dallas Cowboys, soon to be free agent Michael Gallup, up and coming player, unfortunately towards ACL, which is a brutal injury to occur at this late in the season. A guy hoping for a contract. We'll see this offseason if team is still willing to give him a contract, because he is a playmaker that has just gotten stuck behind two incredible playmakers in CeeDee Lamb and Amari Cooper, but he goes out there and makes plays. The next man up is Cedric Wilson. Cedric Wilson has played well in the absence of Michael Gallup earlier this season. He played well when Amari Cooper was dealing with his issues. It's going to be tough to roll out Cedric Wilson again because it is a trio. And really, if you include Dalton Schultz, he's option number 4. But the Cowboys offense does like to throw it a lot. It's not the best matchup against the Eagles this week. But again, another guy to keep in mind for daily fantasy if maybe some of the Eagles players don't play, or another guy to look for heading into the playoffs if you do any type of fantasy playoffs, because he will be on a high-powered offense.
Yes, and we keep talking about Fantasy Playoff Challenge. We'll give you guys a little bit more info on that, and we're going to be opening up a league for you guys. So if you're interested in extending your fantasy season a little bit longer, make sure you stay tuned to us next week. But why don't we talk some defenses before we get out of this segment? 2 defenses with some great matchups this week. We'll start off with the Tennessee Titans. They are playing the Houston Texans. Their defense has been more solid of recent weeks already, and the matchup there is just very good in my opinion. I get it. It might be a little scary because the Texans have played better in recent weeks, but the Texans got dominated by the Titans earlier this year, and I see the same thing happening again. So they're one of your better options off the waiver wire for this week.
I 100% agree with George on this one. I think the Titans are my favorite, not my favorite waiver wire ad, my favorite stream of the week, just because they're playing for something. They want revenge for when Houston came in and beat them. They want to lock up that number 1 seed. This team has carried themselves to the potential of being the number 1 seed on their defense. I look for them to have a big game and close out the Texans season in a pretty solid fashion. But if you're unable to get the Tennessee Titans defense, one other defense I do want to talk about is the Colts. They get the Jacksonville Jaguars, who we just watched only put up a few points against the Patriots. Wow, I completely blanked because I'm not used to the Patriots dropping 50 points. But that's what they did. They were unable to score. The Colts, another team, they need to win to get into the playoffs. This would be a huge they need a victory for them. So I look for their defense to come out strong, look for a good matchup. So the 2 teams that are most likely to make the playoffs are, one's guaranteed, one is most likely to make the playoffs in the AFC South. They're 2 defenses that we definitely like a lot this week. You're probably asking yourself, what about tight ends? Guys, we looked all over the waivers. There is not a solid tight end to pick up. If I had to give you one, maybe Cameron Brate, because they just need another pass catching option if you don't like a Cyril Grayson. Touchdown dependent. But honestly, like Smythe in Miami, like he was getting a little bit of action, but do you trust it? The tight ends has been so bad. Just I'm sorry. There's no real true waiver wire option this week for the tight ends.
No, there's not. So we're just stick with the dartboard you've been going with. But there might be a couple of teams to omit from that, and I think that would be for pretty much every position. Why don't we jump in here and talk a couple of teams who could rest starters before we go here on this episode? Starting it off with Cody's Packers. Very interesting situation for the Packers. I could go into it, but Cody, I'll just let you handle what you think the Packers are going to do this week.
Yeah, so the Packers are in the weird situation that the AFC isn't dealing with, but just the NFC. And especially now that we only have one team that gets a bye, is they clinched it. They clinched it in week 17. So week 18 is about as meaningless can get in the NFL. And now you're going to have the age-old question. Do you risk your players versus, a division rival that plays tough? We all talk about how the Lions, they hit hard, they play hard. Their record is they play harder than their record shows. Or do you give your team essentially 3 weeks off? And coming in cold to a playoff game after 3 weeks is definitely tough. I think I would probably play them for at least a little bit. It appears on the surface that is the plan of now. that the Packers plan to play their starters. Will they play the whole game? That's going to be the big question. And I feel like that might be the answer for some of the other teams we're going to talk about. I could see the Packers using this as a warm-up game, for a guy like David Bakhtiari, if he's able to get active. Maybe he plays a quarter, get him back into the vibe. Jair Alexander. They have a lot of guys coming off injury. They would love to get them, 15 to 20 snaps, get them I think George put it perfectly off air before we start recording. This is going to be, the old days of the third preseason game. They play the first quarter.
Mm-hmm.
They play maybe the whole first half, and then they're out because they're going to protect them. So, unfortunately, I think this means for fantasy, if you're playing in week 18, like you're probably not feeling confident playing Aaron Jones. You're not feeling confident playing Devontae Adams. You're not feeling confident playing Aaron Rodgers. You're not feeling confident playing the Green Bay Packers defense because they pull half their starters. We've seen the Lions are able to put up points. So this is a prime example of why we've said it numerous times this show. We've said it numerous times all season. Get your championship in week 17 because here's a high-powered offense that has some superstar fantasy players. I believe Devontae Adams is number 2 or maybe number 1. Cooper Kupp, I think, is number 1 in fantasy. I think Devontae Adams is number 2, and you might not have him heading into your fantasy championship if you play in the last week of the fantasy season.
But even the bigger thing is, a lot of times if a team's going to bench their starters for the entire game, you can normally find that one backup who may be a good fantasy option. If they split, it'll probably be in a situation where all of them will be useless. I think you missed A.J. Dillon on your list of people that I don't trust for this week because he's probably not going to play much into the second quarter, if at all. But he might be forced to get a couple of carries because they only have 3 running backs on their depth chart. And the other guy is Patrick Taylor Jr., who I had to look up on their depth chart because I had no idea who their third running back was. But in a normal situation, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, no idea who he was, but he came in when we pulled the starters last week, and he had, 4 missed tackles and 6 carries and had average 3.5 yards after contact. So he's a big, powerful running back that they might just, run, pass, punt. That's how the game could be because they want to get out there. So, and with the coach, I wouldn't be surprised if they have a couple guys, running backs on their practice squad, if they activate them for Sunday so they don't have to play in Aaron Jones. Or it'll be interesting on how that 46-man roster shakes up because you'll be able to tell then are they going to go in with 46, then play guys and then have to put them back in if players get injured. That would be interesting to see. But I stole your thunder, so I'll let you wrap up what you were saying about the Green Bay Packers.
Yeah. But there might have been a wide receiver even I would think about starting in a situation where if I knew they were getting a full game, maybe they could get me a 10-point game, maybe an Amari Rodgers if he's back off the COVID list or an Equinemius St. Brown. But if they're not going to play the full game, they're not talented enough players for me to feel confident throwing out there in my lineup. So maybe you play a Patrick Taylor if you're bold or if you're playing for a 7th place or something and you just want to have a little fun. But the Packers situation is probably the worst of the 3 because the split just means that no player is going to play a full 4 quarters and you're probably going to be touchdown dependent with anybody you try to touch on this roster.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe if you're going to play someone, think about Josiah DeGuara as a tight end dartboard, because he's a guy that could play the whole game, no matter which starters are out there. Whether it's Jordan Love, whether it's Aaron Rodgers. Heck, and maybe the Packers do end up playing the whole game. Maybe we'll know more of that, what their plan is on Thursday or Friday, whenever the next show, or Friday or Saturday, whenever the next show comes out. We'll have a better idea of what the plan is. We'll see more throughout the week. But we're at that time where teams are thinking more about the playoffs there, especially when they're already locked up. I will say there is a record that Adams is chasing. So I think he's going to play, but it's only 27 yards. So even that, that's not like he can get that in the first quarter, and then they're like, okay, Rodgers, Adams, you're done.
Yeah.
So it's not even, and that's gonna feel awful to not play Devontae Adams in your fantasy playoffs. I mean, I guess you could question: do you think if he's going to play I'll ask you this question: if Devontae Adams, he's going to play one half of football, would you play him over any of those waiver wide receivers? Because it wasn't a great list of waiver wide receiver additions. Would you still take the high-powered of Devontae Adams over a guy like Cyril Grayson or Marquez Callaway? Or even if he's only playing a half, you have to go with one of those other guys.
Okay, if you can guarantee me he's going to play a half, the only waiver wide receiver I would think about playing over him probably is Cyril Grayson, because I think he seems to be the safest waiver play because he's basically playing that wide receiver 2 and even slash wide receiver 1 if they're with Mike Evans being limited in Tampa Bay with Tom Brady. Other than that, I would think about playing Adams for that half. Maybe you can get me 50 yards and a touchdown. That's very well in the realm of possibilities for a half for Adams against the Lions, but it's still sketchy. I just think that just the star power there, if you can guarantee me a half, puts me over Cedric Wilson and Braxton Berrios, Marquez Callaway. It just shows how weak the waiver wire is and why you shouldn't be playing this week.
Absolutely. And, the other two teams that are both in the NFC, because we talked about it a little bit, because the AFC, there's a lot of moving parts. There's still 4 teams that have potential at the bye. There's 4 teams fighting for 2 final wildcard spots. So there's a lot more competitiveness. This week means a lot more. So if you're an AFC dominant team, hopefully you have some strong players. But, speaking of he's not on the list, but I will talk about the Bengals one more time in this episode. Joe Burrow did not take the final kneel down because of his knee. Now, he said after the game he thought that we could go in there and he thought he could go in, but out of precaution they took him out. Now, George, you have the scenarios in front of you, but I believe if Kansas City wins, that eliminates the Broncos on Saturday. That eliminates the Bengals from winning or getting the number 1 seed because they're still a game behind.
Yes.
So a guy
that would eliminate the Bengals from number 1 seed contention. So they are actually a team that could be on the fence for benching their starters, but that would be a late audible to call because you're going to have to make that move Saturday night after the Chiefs play if the Chiefs win.
Right. And they might not even know. They might not even say anything thinking that they're going to play everybody. And then because Joe Burrow's still dealing with his finger, if he did tweak his knee, the 3 or 4 seed at this point isn't, a big difference. They could just go in there and say, we're gonna rest our quarterback. And if they only rest Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins take big hits with Brandon Allen. It's unfortunate. Yeah. So that's another team. But the two other names we do got to talk about is that Saturday night matchup, the Dallas Cowboys and the Philadelphia Eagles, because these two teams, they're division rivals. Like, they don't want to see either of these teams win, but the Eagles are dealing with COVID as we record this. The Cowboys, I mean, there is still an outside shot they can, get up to the number 2 seed. I mean, they need a lot of things to go right to make that happen. But these are another two teams that we're going to have to wait and see on who they're going to play. But thankfully, this matchup is at least Saturday night. So if they come out and say, oh, Jalen Hurts isn't playing, oh, Dak Prescott isn't playing, well, then we can adjust for the Sunday slate. But
yes,
I think if I'm right, I think George will agree with me. I think the Eagles have a higher chance of resting players than a team like the Cowboys.
I agree, because first off, we talked about the COVID situation already. There's a good chance that Dallas Goedert gets activated off the COVID list and doesn't play. And same with Jordan Howard or Boston Scott, or they play limited. Because number one, we talked about players coming off the COVID list having problems with stamina, missing the whole week of practice. And then, them having the 7 or the 6 seed is no different. The Cowboys may play because they have a shot at the 2 seed. The difference between the 2 and the 4 is much different than the difference between the 6 and the 7. But even yet, there's 9, I have it in front of me, 9 playoff scenarios for the NFC. 7 of them have the Cowboys in the 4 seed, and 7 of them have the Eagles in the 7 seed. So it's most likely are going to stay exactly where they are, which is why we're talking about what's the point of this game for them. Because so many dominoes have to fall. So I think the Eagles have the much better chance of benching their starters. And the only thing is, like, that actually kind of helps because, you know, if Jalen Hurts doesn't play, Gardner Minshew might be might be a solid play for you in a championship game. He's been solid before. We talked about Kenny Gainwell already. He could be a solid play. I mean, the wide receiver room is a lot less exciting. You might have a shot at Greg Ward, but I wouldn't touch him unless it's daily fantasy. But like Gardner Minshew and Kenny Gainwell are two guys that could jump up and actually be fantasy players if they're given a full game.
Yeah, that's definitely something we'll have to monitor. I do have to ask you: is there any scenario where it is the Cowboys get the 3 seed and the Eagles get the 6 seed, and we see this matchup again in the first round of the playoffs?
There is a scenario where they go 7-2. So they would play each
7-2.
other in the first round. So 7-2 is the only way. That's a situation where Dallas wins. So it's San Francisco, Seattle, Carolina, Dallas are the 4 winners in those key NFC games to get Philly against Dallas next week.
Wow. Well, maybe I know Eagles fans, Cowboys fans, they don't want the 3-game. That's always the worst, to play a divisional rival in the playoffs, especially if you just come off of playing them the week prior. But those are just some of the teams, and like we mentioned, we'll definitely have to follow the injury reports this week, especially those. Again, not only are these guys not playing, but if players are a little banged up, but they're already in the playoffs, they might get a week to rest. Because yes, while the 4 seed or the 3 seed might be better than the 4 seed, you might try to play matchups. Having your top guys available for the playoffs is what is more important. But there is a lot of great matchups that we will definitely cover in our next episode. But as always, thank you for listening to another episode of the Couch GMs podcast. Again, remember, Tyler Snyder, he's not with us. Go give him some love. Congratulate him on his new engagement. But that would involve you getting involved, which he always likes to tell you, that this podcast is more fun for you and more fun for us when you get involved.
Man, that was a solid tie-in there, Cody. I'll give it to you. Congratulations again to Tyler and Shelby. Congratulations to Cody on your championship, and congratulations to everyone out there who locked up a title
You too, George.
last
You too.
week. Thank you. I appreciate it. I didn't want to pat my own back. It would seem too wrong. But yes, thank you one more time for listening in to the Couch GMs podcast. For Cody Roadcap, I'm George Kerth, and we'll see you all later in the week to break down every game from week to week.